Oh boy, this is going to be a mess. Partly because I'm doing this to appease the algorithm so that way I don't get bumped off for not making too many videos. Partly because this is unscripted. And also because I'm trying to use this opportunity as an announcement that I'm no longer going to publicly make the promise that I'm going to make one video per month as a goal. While that's been super useful at making sure that I keep working on things, it's also made this hobby like a little bit unfun because the stress of meeting deadlines has been getting in the way of enjoyment, especially now that I have a job and things are kind of getting in the way of things, and I don't need more stress like that in my life. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So this should come as no surprise, but I enjoyed all the Star Wars stuff that I've come across this past year. Granted, I'm about 2 years behind on the comics and even further behind in the books, but all of the movies and TV shows that I've had a chance to catch up on have been pretty great. The main ones, of course, being The Mandalorian, The Resistance Season 2, the final season of that, in fact, and The Rise of Skywalker. I've liked all three of them. In fact, when it comes to The Rise of Skywalker, I think the surprising thing, at least when it comes to just kind of a standard like media perception of it, is that it was my favorite of the sequel trilogy. Judging from the way that, most critics and, most people reacted to the movie, that's kind of like the extent of my hot take. The movie moved super fast. It had a ton of action. I really liked the themes that it tried to present and do its best to explore. I liked the conclusions of the themes that it did manage to fill out. I loved the fact that Palpatine had this like really pulp science fiction-y just return to it. I'm majorly disappointed by the lack of genuinely unique and new ship designs, or at the very least lack of camera time spent on those ships. I really wanted to see a lot of distinct cool designs on the screen, and besides like a cool resistance transport that has a pretty fun moment, most of the ships are derivative updates, and that's like my biggest disappointment. It's like the one thing I care about when it comes to Star Wars fiction. Like, I don't care about whether the story is good or coherent. I just need cool new ships that you can have cool updates and stuff, but what I really want is like unique and neat designs that feel Star Wars-y. Like, give me some wild stuff, like how things that feel super different, like from the Revenge of the Sith, you had all of these, cool different designs for the Rebel fleet, and then all of a sudden in the Phantom Menace you have these sleek and very pretty Naboo starships fighting droid ships that have these kind of skeletal qualities to them, and then, further down the line you have the awesome arsenal, the Clone Army, with their gunships and their weird prototype early versions of TIE fighters, and the ARC-170, which like has a lineage with the Z95 and the X-Wing and stuff like that. That's what I really prioritize here when it comes to Star Wars. If it gives me that, I'm happy. If it doesn't, then, well, it's got to give me something else. And Rise of Skywalker gave me that something else. This was just a ton of fun for me, and I liked it a lot. It is my favorite of the sequel trilogy. I'm willing to say that it's good even, but that's enough of that. What's something that's much less controversial to say is The Mandalorian is great. Weirdly enough, it's one of those shows that I can actually point to as saying, hey, if you've never Star Wars before, and you don't feel like watching a movie, go ahead and enjoy these TV episodes. It's pretty good in my opinion because it is such a self-contained story. It doesn't really tie into a lot of the broader cast or the storylines associated with them, so you don't really have cameos from like Darth Vader or what have you. Instead, you just have this story about a dude and a baby and a bounty that's gone wrong on said baby. It's just kind of like this solidly good show that I can pretty much recommend to anyone. The only like caveat I would give is that the show moves slowly. It's very much a Western in that sense. It tries to take its time with its imagery, and it fills it with a fantastic soundtrack. It's one of those things where it's all like, hey, if you weren't satisfied by the sequel trilogy films, go ahead and give The Mandalorian a shot. It might be what you're looking for. If you weren't satisfied by the prequel films and you're still burned from that, go ahead and give The Mandalorian a shot. It might be what you're looking for. Didn't like even the original trilogy because you felt it was too pulpy or moved at a pace that you thought wasn't thoughtful enough, screw it. Give The Mandalorian a shot. It might be what you're looking for. It's this fascinating piece of media that it can be a wonderful entry point to not just the expanded universe of Star Wars, but to the universe itself. And I think that's super great. And last but certainly not least is Resistance Season 2. I enjoyed it, but I'm going to be stealing Germain Lussier's words here because it just perfectly encapsulates my feelings of the show. I mean, parts of it were amazing, parts of it were not, and it was always brimming with untapped potential. It had everything you wanted, but didn't come close to giving you enough, and that's just kind of what it feels like at the end of the day. It does have a lot of cool stuff, and unlike a lot of the other shows, unlike The Mandalorian, unlike The Rise of Skywalker, tons of cool ships. I loved like almost all of them. You even get to look at some of the ships that are only hinted at, like the Maison Marionette, which you see the back end of in The Force Awakens. That's the ship that Finn was about to join before Starkiller Base fires. It shows up in its like full form here in Rebels. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I love Sedona Thano. But at the same time, this show is kind of positioned in a really awkward way because unlike, say, the Clone Wars or Rebels, which are tightly enmeshed or at the very least significantly connected to the broader conflict, so you have instances in which established characters show up and either continue their arcs or make an impact on the rest of the cast, like in the way that Darth Vader and Palpatine make a significant role in Rebels, in the way that, you know, the entire cast of the prequel trilogy at one point almost shows up in the Clone Wars doing like important things. Rebels just kind of gets caught in this weird spot where it's between what Rebels and the Clone Wars do and also what the Mandalorian does, which is create an entirely standalone story about people that you care about because you've come to care about them as a result of the stories that you've encountered with them in the show. Because Rise of Skywalker is kind of in the middle, it just kind of has this unfortunate situation where, yes, it's connected to the broader like struggles in the sequel trilogy between the Resistance and the First Order. Poe Dameron inserts Kaz into the Colossus in order to spy for the Resistance. Leia talks to Kaz every once in a while and they have their own kind of connection to it. Hux and Kylo Ren show up, and so clearly they are a part of this broader conflict, but they don't matter to it. And I say it's disposable in the sense that the way that Resistance is set up is that it doesn't really provide anything that feels necessary to experience, or at the very least enriches the sequel trilogy in a way that elevates those original films. Which is kind of a bummer in my opinion, because there's a lot that could have happened with Resistance that could have been a wonderful companion to the films. Instead, you just sort of have this show that ends and you don't really get a good sense for what happens after. And I don't know if Lucasfilm is interested in re-exploring this era, which is a kind of a bummer, because a lot of the designs are super cool in the same way that like the prequel era is neat because all the designs are like so different from the original trilogy. The sequel era does do a lot of cool stuff of kind of making an attempt to evolve the designs forward, and those attempts have been really rad. And the original designs for the sequel that were introduced in Resistance are, in my opinion, just as if not more rad than what we saw in both the prequel and the original trilogy. But time will tell. Hopefully I'm wrong and Lucasfilm plans to let people run wild in this era rather than just kind of abandoning it and moving on to the rumored High Republic super duper prequel era. But either way, I'm just super happy with Star Wars right now, and I can't wait to get caught up on comics and books. So laid out on the screen before you are a list of the top 10 games for 2019, and they were all able to make the list because they were the only games I played in 2019. Now, I kind of want to lead with this little bit of a gag because I think it's interesting that end-of-year lists are so predicated on a person's own experiences, their knowledge of a particular genre, what games they've played, if they've played games at all, how new they're to actually making games, how they play games, like if they have to play games for review versus just playing them for fun. That's going to massively impact things. And I just think the entire like idea of how these lists get formed is just really cool. But most importantly, and I think ironically really, is that end of year lists of an individual don't actually matter. If you post something on Twitter or even here in this, little gag of mine that I put up, like, who cares? Like, no one's going to put that on like the collector's edition for a box or something like that, or as a part of a banner for their Steam sale. But the end of year or game of the year kind of awards that are given out by major publications like Polygon, Kotaku, GameSpot, Game Informer, even the Game Awards are a much bigger deal, at least when it comes to people trying to either give out pitches or just kind of re-advertise maybe the Game of the Year edition version of whatever game they have, or the re-release or remake of whatever game. That way they can advertise it as like, hey, you remember this game that everyone really liked that came out 2, 3, 5, 30 years ago? Well, it's back. And I think it's like mostly fascinating because when it comes to these like end of year lists, or even just the awarding of the game of the year, it's the one time where all of these major publications behave in a way that a lot of bad faith actors present these game publications to actually, behave in. And so what I mean by that is most of these publications, they're just a small collection of staff writers / editors who do their best to put out content. Maybe it's some news reporting or investigative journalism, or just, general editorial pieces, opinion pieces and stuff like that, and reviews. But they are all like supported by a large group of freelancers and other kinds of contractors who come in and provide and fill in with other content. Generally, it's reviewers. To give an example, my friend David Jagno is the editor at Upload VR, and he does a lot of work in that space, but to supplement his income, he will also write reviews for IGN and other publications that don't have anything to do with the VR work that he does at Upload. And so what ends up happening is that the branding of these major websites tend to swallow the byline. And so even though my friend David was the one who reviewed, I believe, the most recent Dynasty Warriors game for IGN, that review isn't part of his bibliography, so to speak, that you can just kind of follow in like a meaningful way through his either YouTube channel or for his brand. It's just the IGN branded review. It is the IGN review. And so because of the way that these major websites kind of present themselves, their brand supersedes whatever byline or sub-brand for the actual writer. This, of course, gives people the impression that these websites are a bit more monolithic than they really are. There's a couple of controversial in games journalism spaces, donkey videos that kind of cover this in a sort of satirical way. It's just a kind of the manner in which GameSpot and IGN and all these other companies are like, hey, they don't actually have specific writers who have actual like consistent bylines when it comes to their reviews, because, well, generally speaking, most of their staff writers, or at least for the bigger websites like IGN, like they're not able to review consistently. There might be scheduling conflicts, there might be some other problems, and all of this kind of get in the way and result in the byline for the individual just kind of getting lost. So Max Scoville or Brian Altano, even though they do things like Up at Noon and all this other stuff at IGN, whenever they write a review, those reviews for whatever reason don't feel like they're linked to those two people as much as they're linked to the IGN brand. As a result, it kind of feels like these brands kind of work in concert. And so whenever IGN puts out a review, people just kind of have this perception that everyone who works at IGN or whatever either like thinks the same way or is on the same page about particular games. And so whatever the IGN review says is clearly the opinion, or at the very least the consensus of, or the final agreed upon decision of the major publishing company. And that's just really not the case. Usually you have an editor who just really tries to guide the freelancer that they happen to have into writing the review if the editor doesn't write it himself, and they say, hey, this is how we do things, this is the tone that we expect, this is what we want you to hit, and then they just kind of give the freelancer the freedom to do the review however they feel is appropriate. Maybe they want to focus on mechanics, maybe they want to focus on themes and stories and all that other stuff, but whatever happens to be the case, it is almost entirely under the contractor's control. Generally speaking, this is, of course, the specifics are something that are sort of super hidden. And so I can't really say that this is the exact way that things are go. But generally speaking, most editors are going to be like, we just want to make sure that you fit within the IGN brand, but you can just go ahead and write whatever your experience with the game and be honest about that. And that's what they really want. However, at the end of the year, once they put out this list, that's when these discussions happen. The kind of monolithic, discussions within the staff and across various other members of their own, like, you know, professional circle, start to really have these sorts of discussions where it's sort of like, all right, okay, so now we're going to put the Game of the Year stand for IGN or GameStop or whatever. What are we all going to basically have to fully commit to as, yeah, we work here and this place that we work at is going to go ahead and say this is the best game that came out in whatever year we happen to be in, or happen to have just gone out of. And I think that's just kind of the most fascinating thing, because that's really where they have to make their case for whatever particular game they happen to be. And then even when the individual may have their own personal favorite game of the year or whatnot, they still contributed to the sort of movement towards that sort of final consensus for however many game of the years they happen to announce, or whatever the top X games happen to be for a particular year. And so I just think that's like the funniest bit, is that, like, no, you're wrong. These companies are just made of a whole bunch of different people with their own different opinions. And those opinions are just reflected in their work. It doesn't reflect everybody, except when they kind of do the end of the year thing where ideally everyone in the staff has a say and they have a big fight over things, and then they finally reach a consensus together, ideally, on making the decision of what the best game happens to be every year. I just think that's kind of just like a high level of irony there, especially because Game of the Year decisions tend to also be snapshots as to what that publication or group of people in the publication value. And I always think it's just kind of interesting to just kind of see the history of various games of the years from different publications, which ones picked what game. GameSpot picking Demon's Souls the years that it came out, when the Souls-like genre was super under the radar, and then Dark Souls came out later and just kind of blew everything up. Or how Sekiro won the Game Awards, but Control won some other company, or I guess I don't remember, but the other nominees that were basically there won in various other publications, and just kind of seeing the differences, what the various publications value. It's just kind of this like cool little snapshot of what people thought of the year after the year went through, and seeing that just kind of change year in and year out is just, in my opinion, super fascinating. Now, the main reason that I wasn't really able to get to more than 10 new games last year was because I was unemployed for the past 2 years or so, and it was really hard for me to play anything that wasn't some kind of free-to-play or live service title that I already owned. And I'll be honest, that kind of sucked. Not because these games were bad. Magic the Gathering is great, Hearthstone's super solid, all of these games are fine to wonderful, but the economic foundations that they have just get in the way of being able to enjoy these games on my terms. Most of it is just weaponized FOMO. All of these games have some sort of lockout timer that make it so that way if you really want to make any kind of meaningful progress, you have to come in and play the game on their terms. If you don't, then you're going to miss out on something, and that missing out will super matter. Or at the very least, that missing out will make it so that way your experience isn't going to be as good, or even have the same amount of content as other players who have either chosen to spend more time on the game or just chosen to spend more money on it. Battlefield 5 has this awkward situation where, like, you only have a week to unlock either a cosmetic or sometimes a weapon, and if you miss that week, then you're going to have to spend some kind of currency on it, whether it's the real money currency or the in-game earned currency. And it's not really necessary. Like, I think these weekly challenges would have been pretty neat to just kind of have a thing you can select. The game already has like an optional quest system where you go into a menu and then you determine which quests you're going to be working on during any given match. You can replicate that system with all of the Tides of War weekly challenges. On top of that, you could probably just go further and just replicate it with Tides of War. So you could just sit down and be like, all right, this week I'm going to work on chapter 5, which has all the cool Pacific content. And so you just keep working on that, and maybe you'll pick which weekly challenge is associated with that. And if you miss one, cool, it just kind of gets put into your queue that you can work on, and have each new challenge come out every single week. But if someone leaves the game after a year or so, or maybe even longer, or even gets the game after the chapters have been over, they can go back and they have all of this stuff, all of these different ways to play the game just readily available for them, and it encouraged all these kind of different play styles. And instead they're just like, nope, if you don't do it when we tell you to do it, then you'll never get to do it at all. Sucks to suck. Pay me. And that just feels really awful. And it all just feels really unnecessary. Like, there's gotta be a better way to monetize these things, especially because a lot of these games are either sequels to or adaptations of long-running games with super engaged fan bases and people who are just more than willing to play these games on their own terms. Like, Battlefield 5 has been around, the Battlefield franchise has been around for however many years of people just kind of jamming the original game with each other just forever in these massive battles, and they've never really needed even a new content to come out for servers to kind of still spin up and have people just kind of play with each other for years at a time. Magic the Gathering has been around for 30 years, and while it has a constant content release, people are still willing to just kind of go to, you know, their local comic shop and just kind of play casually with people both before and after the weekly standard or modern or whatever tournament. It seems that there's a better way to monetize these progression systems than just merely just kind of weaponizing FOMO so that way people sit down and come in and week out. I know the developers are trying to balance between making sure that their investors and bosses are happy versus the broader customer base, but it just kind of feels that a lot of these live service games tend to slant more towards the business end of things rather than, say, you know, actually providing a decent service. A lot of these psychological tricks just are intended to just extract more money in a way that doesn't really feel like you're getting the kind of value, so to speak, that they sort of present their options as. I know for a lot of these games you're getting a lot of free content updates, but they're still cordoning off some of that content, even if it's cosmetic, away. And sometimes the lion's share of the new content isn't going to be the new map or the new weapons, but it's going to be like the 300 or so pieces of cosmetic that allow you to play dress up with your G.I. Joe action figure. And honestly, there really isn't much of a way around this when it comes to trying to, quote, fix this problem. It's a systemic business end of it. Like, these games could be just way better with fewer psychological garbage having to just kind of get their claws into it if these people didn't care about making obscene profits, right? Yeah, sure, you can make money off these games, and there are ways in which you can make these sorts of monetization systems more humane and still wildly popular and profitable. Like, the only thing that I really think should be 100% like a practice that should be stopped, these companies should be like, stop being afraid of the success of their own game types, right? Battlefield 5, but Magic the Gathering Arena in particular have this awful situation where they just clamp down on how you're able to play at any given point in time or how you're able to progress with the given play modes. And I just feel like the games are good enough on their own that you don't need to just kind of paywall or cordon off certain game modes just because you have concerns about population density and things like that. Like, that should be just, they should just stop doing that. Like, I think the best game, ironically, for this is Battlefield 2, which introduces all these new modes, keeps them on forever. All of them help progress and level up all of your different characters. You get to play however you want. You want to do Galactic Conquest? Go for it. You want to do Galactic Assault? That's sweet. Want to play with your TIE fighters and stuff? Go ahead and do that. Want to do PvE? Awesome. You can have both arcade and the new co-op feature that was introduced, I think, late last year. All of these options are magnificent, and they all help you have a good time and keep playing and earn more stuff. Like, it's really funny that the poster boy for the worst economic system possible in AAA video games does it better than some of the newer titles that are viewed more favorably. But that's just kind of my 2 cents on it. Revisiting old games can be a little bit of a toss-up because you don't know if you're going to be fighting the user interface every 15 seconds or if you're actually going to get this, like, even if unpolished, fairly engaging experience. Luckily, Dragon Quest, the original one, even if it was re-released on the Switch, actually ends up being a pretty solid argument for why menu-based combat is good, actually. It was actually kind of surprising because, at the very least, in the kind of more modern sense, a lot of people are super a negative on menu-based combat, and for a good reason. Most modern JRPGs, you eventually get to a point where either the menu-based combat just doesn't matter, you can just smash A to kind of beat up all the enemies because you're massively overleveled, or the combat itself becomes tedious and you just kind of no longer holds your attention the same way that it did necessarily at the beginning of the game. Other people are also just kind of immediately turned off by it because they don't think it looks good, or there might be some aesthetic reasons. But it was really weird because Dragon Quest is able to make the argument that no, this is actually a good form of gameplay and it's engaging, even though it rips out most of the cruft, so to speak, that has kind of existed in menu-based combat. In Dragon Quest, you only have your attack command. You only have a single hurt spell, a single heal spell. You can put monsters to sleep, but I don't think there's any other condition that I can remember. And you can, of course, like try to run away. And that's it. Those are your options. There's no like an elemental like damage or resistance system or weakness system. There's no things where you can like turn off someone's spell casting through silence effects, or there's no like buffs for your party that allows them to be stronger. It is just physical damage, magic damage, sleep, and healing, and run away. And those are your options, and it kind of creates interesting sort of puzzles in their own way. Like when you only have those options, suddenly whenever you face a monster, you have to ask yourself a series of questions. Okay, is this monster weak to physical attacks? Do they dodge a lot? Are they weak to magic? Or are they just even hittable by magic? And how many hits does it take to kill them with magic versus physical attacks? How much damage do I take whenever they hit me? And all these other sorts of things. So you have to like puzzle out through trial and error a little bit the most efficient way to defeat a monster. That in turn rewards you with better resource management in the in-between fight sections, where you're trying to sit down and try to gauge, okay, I have this much health left and this much mana. How much mana am I going to convert back into my health? Do I keep going and pressing on to the next town? Do I go back and try to rest up and try to level up a little bit by grinding on more monsters? It's an interesting kind of back and forth. Do I keep trying to earn more money to upgrade my weapons or upgrade my armor so that way I take less damage or deal more to monsters? Or do I press on to the next town, skip the current upgrade set, and try to super upgrade a little bit later down on the line, and save some of the money that I currently have? That it's not a intensely deep experience, but it's there, and it was engaging in me enough for me to at least like drain the entire battery on my Switch. So at least for me, there's this puzzle-like element to menu-based combat that I think a lot of people just sort of either lose sight of or aren't interested in really engaging, and that's entirely fine. A lot of people think that menu-based combat is a waste of time that gets in the way of things like story progression. But Dragon Quest at least makes the argument here that menu-based combat, even in its like most pared down, straightforward, and simple form, is engaging enough on its own right that it can push people through some of the most threadbare and kind of basic narrative framing. Here you are, hero, go forth and kill the dragon is all you really get. And yet going out and doing it over and over and over again is still a lot of fun. So there you have it. It's a collection of meandering thoughts on barely related topics. As I mentioned before, I did most of this kind of unscripted work in order to try to get a video out for this month to kind of get ahead of the YouTube algorithm, but it mostly does serve as a sort of announcement that, hey, I'm no longer going to try to hit that monthly deadline anymore. At least not with my scripted content. There might be some unscripted video stuff that I might put out there to see if I can balance that with some of the more scripted work, but you know, I'm just really busy with work that I can't put in the kind of time to meet that monthly deadline with work that I'm happy with. So hopefully my videos will get better. They're probably not going to get longer, but the production might up just a little bit because I no longer have to worry about meeting up an arbitrary deadline. So here's to making videos, and thanks for watching.